Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity's podcast. We are so glad you're here. As always, I'm here with Maria Brandel. We are discussing the grave difficulties and the secret joys of gender. We are also about the business of trying to discern the roots of transgenderism by understanding it as a multivalent phenomenon, many layers like an onion, and many sources, because our underlying intuition, which is a really simple one, I'm sure we've all had it, is that something this incredible seeming couldn't take such a natural root in our culture without coming from a lot of different places at once.
How is it that being transgender is something that appears as normal and reasonable to the average person? Like something has to shift in a lot of different layers, not just in the way that we think, but also in the way that we do society, and to kind of borrow queer theory a little bit, to enact gender. Wow, that's not blood. That's just paint on your arm.
I'm sorry. Yeah, some shelves. Last time, we discussed capitalism, and we specifically discussed the way that the economics of mercantilism, moving from feudalism into capitalism, basically destroyed what was a really burgeoning sphere of authority for women, and ended up emphasizing the reproductive function for both men and women as the sort of function über alles, the main thing that gender was about, the main thing that it was for, and this invited a lot of state regulation into the world of gender.
Right, and then also just the economic and social structure shift that happened as people were moving away from subsistence living into the cities, and how that ends up constricting gender roles in a way that just wasn't around before. And so the way that women appear is simply different, because if you're living a subsistence lifestyle, women, the role that women have for the maintenance of the farm or just your whole situation is a lot more obvious. You just see it, you interact with it every day.
Yeah.
But as soon as you move into the cities, women's role becomes more and more kind of isolated as wage labor takes over, and the only work that's seen as being actual work is that which makes money. And since so much of women's work also involves the raising of children, and it's not as if men pay women to do that, then women start to be seen as like the things that are not made for work.
Yes.
They're just not capable of work.
Yep.
And the work that they are doing isn't being recognized. And then I think especially in high society, because women aren't doing like really difficult tasks or like managing their own household, managing all the women who are working together, then they're seen as even more useless. And it's not because people in that society were particularly dumb. It was just the appearance of, this is what women do, this is what women are capable of, and they're not capable of these particular roles. And it's more that the roles had just shifted, and when the roles and structures shift, your imagination also shifts along with that. Oh, this is just what people are for, what people do.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you can see pretty much in every movement into more and more bizarreness, often the aristocratic classes and their vices sort of predict what's going to happen generally.
Right.
And so
it just kind of goes down to the lower classes over time.
Exactly. And so I think you see a lot of that. Today, we are going to discuss not so much the economic side, but the symbolic side. Mm-hmm. And in a word, we want to make an argument that the loss of the symbol of the Virgin in our society has laid the groundwork in some ways for just the confusion we experience about gender today. Fair?
Right. Yeah. I like to think about it in terms of constricting the cultural imagination. So if you have a world in which X thing is possible, it's a real job, it's a real thing, and it's normal, it's been normalized, then it changes the way you see your own possibilities. So, I mean, if we're looking at the transgender situation today, like I remember when I was teaching, there was a lot of like young girls who were, figuring out their sexuality, but now that they've been presented with this transgender thing, here's this new option that's on the table. And so that kind of expands the way that they even interpret their own kind of normal experience in a way that wasn't like a cultural option before. It just wasn't a part of your imagination.
Yes.
So it changes the way that you are going to act. It's going to change the way that you interpret your own experiences. Beyond it just being an idea in your mind, the fact that it is out there as a real cultural instantiated thing that's been accepted and considered normal. Yeah.
But obviously at the same time, we don't want to fall into the trap that I sometimes find people fall into when it comes to conversations of gender, where they just want to say, well, it's sort of a copycat phenomenon. So it's like, well, you give people this sort of confusion and then suddenly they're acting on it. And it's true that this happens, that we make use of the images and narratives available to us. And usually we receive those images and narratives from a position of less power, like as youth or in high school, vis-a-vis the ones who are producing the narrative and producing the images. And that's true, but it's also, it can be taken too far if you imagine that we aren't compelled by what appears to be true at some point. That we aren't compelled by what appears to fit. It's not simply like, any narrative would work, any lie would work.
There has to be a certain fittingness in the thing that's being presented for it to have such a cultural consequence, for people to really respond to it.
Which is why there's no logical reason why you couldn't have transracialism as a narrative and a reality that everyone accepted as part of their growing experience and picking which race they want to belong to, but it doesn't have power in our society.
It doesn't fit.
It doesn't meet with power. In fact, it meets with an immediate rejection, so it doesn't happen. It doesn't work. But you're right that the intelligibility of the virgin is gone. I would argue that it simply doesn't make sense on a cultural level. Obviously, there are, imagine this, actively, right now, people, maybe at this moment, making vows to be virgins, to consecrate their lives entirely to God, and to have no sexual relation at all, forever. That's happening. So when we say that it's not a cultural symbol, we just mean that it doesn't have efficacy as a cultural symbol. It doesn't appear to be a general possibility. If you have that call, you are going to appear alarming and odd if you choose to follow it, or more likely, you simply won't find how to live out that call. Like the resources, the teachers, the images, the narratives won't be present to you. And I think that's a situation.
It's not around in the same way that it was around in medieval Christianity. I mean, like if you grew up in a very Catholic home, then you kind of have a similar experience of, religious life is a normal thing. And it's just something that like I should consider as a possibility for my life. But if you don't happen to grow up in those circles, which is most people, it's not going to have a cultural force just because it's not on the radar.
Right.
Totally. But I think the point of discussing the fact that this really isn't around anymore is that it does shift our cultural imagination of how we understand gender. If we have a place in society where men and women have meaning and purpose on their own, in a way that's fundamentally not tied to procreation, that is just going to change the way that you think about men and women. It's also going to change the way that you think about yourself, because I am always a person who could have been a religious.
Absolutely.
So clearly, like there's this possibility of my gender having meaning that's beyond my role in procreation or the family.
Yeah, I mean, the virgin was not simply a symbol available within Christianity, but was the ideal. This is really important to emphasize, that what we've lost is the superior status of the virgin, and then the inferior status of the life of marriage and procreation. Now, this doesn't really alarm any Christian, because there's hierarchy sort of built into everything. Everything we do is in layers and grades of ascent and descent, and so there's no sense of unfairness in this at all. But when the virgin is instantiated as an ideal within Christianity, and we'll speak more about how this happens, it has to influence everyone. Because even if you're married, you understand that part of your vocation of marriage is not just this sort of endless line of reproduction where you're saying, I'm going to have kids, then my kids are going to have kids.
Right.
As an ideal of the family is the production of virgins, which actually happens when you produce children.
You want kids to become...
But you want them to become... you want them to vow themselves to virginity.
Right.
And this is...
Well, it changes your role within society, because suddenly you live within a human society in which like these celibate people and you yourself are working towards the same goal.
Yeah.
Even your role in procreation and your role in the family is completed and is even made more intelligible by the life of consecrated virginity, because it is such a symbol of the fact that like ultimately you are for God alone. And this is the trajectory of every human life. And the consecrated religious have a particular role and symbolize that to like the umpteenth degree, but that's ultimately what you want for your children and what you want for yourself. So it changes the way that you see yourself, you see your possibilities, you see the way that your gender means something. And I think that's kind of enough to set the table for why we're talking about it, and why it could have such an effect when that's no longer like a culturally accepted symbol. I mean, it's just not a possibility in our society anymore.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist.
Yeah, I want to say one more thing just because it's in my head and I'm worried that it won't come up naturally otherwise. So, and then we'll lose this great insight. I'm sure it's a great insight. It's this experience that you have where virginity is an ideal. It is a way of signifying within society that the person is good, that the person is enough. It's not that marriage necessarily functionalizes or instrumentalizes or just makes you have a sort of use value, as opposed to, a real warm, this person has value in and of themselves. Mm-hmm. But it certainly can lend itself to that temptation, because we can ask ourselves, like, what are we for? And immediately presume that the way that God views us and the way that we are in this world is useful functions for something else. So, because that's obvious in terms of procreation. It's like, I am for my children. Like, I procreate, I give life to others, and then I pass on, the goods and values of my society to my children. And what virginity established as an ideal gives credence to is a moment that's sort of prior to all this questioning, when you look at especially a newborn child, or just someone who is excellent in their state of work or in their craft or in their beauty, and you say something to the effect of, it is good that you are. And there's no other word that comes after that. Not good that you are doing this for society, right. Not good that you are raising money for the homeless, just it is good that you are. Mm-hmm. And what virginity does as an ideal within a society is it says that, that experience can go all the way to the top. Like, a life can be good and worthwhile because God loves that person, and there is no if, there's no contingency, there's no if they do this, X, Y, and Z, but that they are good in their creation and redemption. They are good. And so I think that when we have virginity as an ideal, we have to always understand that, yes, we're speaking about sex, we're speaking about not having sex as a permanent vowed state. But what that symbolizes is not simply the absence of sex, right, but the perfection of the person as a willed and loved creature of God. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that this symbol in society matters because it constantly reinforces us to that. reinforces that in us.
Right.
It's like in a society where your brothers and sisters are becoming nuns and monks and presbyters, then it's very difficult to imagine like, well, my only goodness lies in me fulfilling some sort of function, and if I can't find the function, then I'm just a waste.
Right, because you have friends and family who are showing you the opposite.
Yeah.
I think it is really important to understand like what that really means as what is it that I'm thinking of? Like a symbol in the cultural imagination. That's not to say that in the past, in Christianity, that like everything worked out perfectly, or that people didn't struggle with their own worth or dignity or use or sexuality. But just the fact that you have this ideal as a real and instantiated possibility as an institution, it changes the way that you think and process, even if the place that you are currently at is a lot of confusion and struggling.
Yeah.
It opens up the possibility for your whole society to think about the problems differently.
Totally.
And I think that's the key. So it doesn't, and it's not the case that Christianity figured it out in every single different pocket. I mean, when you do have real corruption, when you have people entering in with their own confusions, there's still going to be problems. But now at least you have like, I'm kind of imagining like being in a room with like the roof opened up. Like, okay, there's like room to expand, whereas before I was living in a closed space.
Yeah. One of the ways I see this just play out even within Catholic communities who obviously are just hanging on by their fingernails to what we have of the tradition. Maybe we know one or two priests. Maybe we've met a religious person. Sometimes it can feel more lively in Steubenville, but I have to realize it's not the entirety of people's life experience. But man, I've just noticed that with miscarriage, there's this real difference in how the Catholic community kind of responds to it, and then how I see it responded to in the rest of the world. And I think it has a lot to do actually with the presence of the Virgin as a symbol. There's a lot, I'm not talking about like the various doctrines of, limbo and, what's the fate of the unbaptized and that. I just mean it's not pushed under the rug. It's seen as a tragedy, and there's an immediate effort to name the child that was miscarried, that died. There is always an effort to have a burial. And there is a very heroic and in some ways tragic effort to see the person who is sometimes literally invisible. Like you cannot see the person.
Right.
And it seems to me that a world that's governed with its ideal in the Virgin, which says this hidden life that doesn't have a sort of function that you can point to and say, yeah, successfully passed on this or that and contributed to society, so we value it. When you have that as an ideal, then even the person who never becomes more than those few cells that begin a human life, then you can see the person in invisibility, because your whole cultural mode is already
there's already value in invisibility, so it's not so hard to see it in the child either.
Yeah, and so then you see there's a lot of other things going on in the secular response to the same phenomenon, but when you're not governed by it, the death of children, miscarriage, it just becomes this very incomprehensible tragedy where it's like they didn't get what they deserved.
Right.
The child had this right to grow. This pregnancy was supposed to come to term. It all ended before anything happened. And what are we going to do? Let's just not talk about it, or if we're going to talk about it, it's in order to move on, because
it's not like there's a hidden in real life and value with that person. That sounds so terrible. Like, I don't think that's what people necessarily think, but if you're not really convinced that this person is still a part of the divine plan and in this mysterious way, they're going to their own fulfillment, because that's not a part of your cultural imagination already, then it just appears as pure tragedy, and it's just unfair. How could God possibly do this? But if you already have a sense that, well, actually what we are for is for God alone in the first place, then like that's the tragedy is that like you didn't get to see it. You didn't get to be a part of it. You didn't get to grow with it.
Yeah.
But you know, that's what the religious are. Like they're called apart by God to grow in secret with him, and it's not something that people on the outside get to watch, to grow with. I mean, you do kind of die to the outside world.
You've written very movingly about this because it was one of your arguments that liberalism can't understand the nun because it can only understand functional values. It can't understand someone who, when they look at the nun, they have to imagine her as doing some charitable work, and that's her worth, or she's, you know, just has some kind of functional way of making us get along, or, you know, improving society, which is not just you vainly imagining, it's also historically what happened. Like it became a law that religious orders had to do something to contribute to society.
Otherwise,
in Europe.
they're just abolished.
They were abolished, yeah. We do not know what to do with a contemplative, because I think for the same reasons that we don't know what to do with a virgin, because we don't know what to do with the pure givenness of the human life. Just given as good, declared good, made because God wants that person to be made.
Right. So, I mean, today, like, we still have a notion of virginity.
Yes.
But yeah, it doesn't take on the same meaning, and I think we'll return to that later when we talk about kind of the Catholic notion of the understanding of what is the symbol of the Virgin, because that was something that, I mean, I remember learning about this, I don't know how many years ago that I was reading things on this, maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, and it completely transformed the way I understood what virginity was, because I think I had still really seen it from a Protestant vision, and it's just different. So I think that kind of can move us into what we wanted to talk about next, is like what changed. When did this happen? This loss of this institutionalized symbol from society, and it really begins with the Reformation. Is the first time that you see the role of monastic life being seriously questioned. I mean, I'm sure there was other places where it was questioned, but it's where it really took off culturally with Martin Luther. So we were taking a look at a particular text. It was Martin Luther writing to the Teutonic Order.
The Crusading Knights. The title is a little lengthy. I think it's something to the effect of an exhortation to the Teutonic Order to... The Knights
of the Teutonic Order, in order that they stop practicing the
false chastity of virginity and start practicing the true chastity
of marriage.
Of wedlock, of marriage,
Okay, that was roughly the long time.
And we'll just say this about Luther. We're not Luther scholars. There are many texts you can point to that Luther attacks celibacy and advocates for essentially universal marriage. Everyone has to get married, except for by a sort of extrinsic, supernatural, divine calling of an individual to the celibate life.
Extremely, extremely rare.
Yeah, he thinks is very rare.
To the point where he doesn't really discuss it, at least not in this letter. But it's kind of a helpful, I think, touchstone point for his perspective and what he thought was going on and why he was advocating for the abolishment of celibacy and, or at least like a celibate priesthood, as well as for women. But I think it's helpful to know that. So he's writing to these knights, but they are an order of monks that were created during the Crusade to both wield the secular sword in defense of Jerusalem, but then also still function as monks. I presume that the sword was kind of irrelevant at this point, but it was kind of the institution that they had set up. And so he is writing to them to say you should just abolish your vow of celibacy. This is unnatural. And take up the true chastity of wedlock. Like you should be able to be within the church hierarchy and be spiritual persons. And you should do that with a wife. And he gives kind of a number of arguments for this. He begins kind of with some practical arguments. Like, look, you're not mendicants. You're not really poor people. You've got this money. You could sustain a family. You could be landlords. You could actually be producing something. You could be helpful to society. So he's got kind of the helpfulness argument. But I think kind of the main argument that he puts forward is he says, quote, "Among the unmarried, there is neither hope nor confidence of chastity, but only constant fear." And basically what was happening during the time of Luther was that there was a lot of corruption within the religious state. And so like these people had taken vows of chastity, and they weren't illicitly allowed to abandon those vows and get married through the church because they had taken permanent vows. And so they would just pick up mistresses on the side. Yeah. And it was fairly common. This is something that Luther saw as being really problematic. And so his opinion was that this is just a really unnatural state. And if you look at Genesis seems to be telling us that having a helpmate is a good thing. Yeah. Having a wife is a good thing. You're denying this good thing to these celibates. Yeah. And they clearly can't keep their vows. So it would just be better to allow them to get married lawfully through the church. So at least they wouldn't be indulging in this sin, because it would be better to just be married than to take these impossible vows and be sinning all the time.
Sure. Which there's certainly something to. Our experience of Luther is one of wondering why a guy went so hard. I mean, that's because he's always like correct about a certain amount of corruption.
Right.
But instead of advocating for reform, he advocates for abolition, essentially. Like, we should just do away with this. And he makes very unconvincing arguments about, virginity not being natural or not being part of God's plan, except for in special cases.
Yeah, well, what's really interesting is that, like, essentially the main part of his argument to me doesn't make sense. It seems like he's saying, like, well, Genesis tells us that God said wives are good. And if you have a state in life of men who don't take wives, that's a contradiction of the statement that wives are good. Right. And so in order for us to be aligned with God's teaching, then like you ought to take a wife.
Right. But obviously it doesn't necessarily follow, because you can affirm that wives are good and not take one.
Right. Right. Which is what St. Paul does.
Right.
So there's a bit in this letter that he does engage that passage, and hopefully people will know what I'm talking about, because I don't have it pulled up in front of me. Like when he talks about, like, oh, wouldn't it be better if everyone was in the same state that I'm in, which is a celibate life. So he wasn't married. And he sees this as being better, but if that's not something you can do, then you ought to get married. Right. So if you can, it is better to be celibate. Yes. And if you can't do that, then you can get married.
Yeah.
And Luther doesn't really engage this. He doesn't really know. I mean, my impression is that he doesn't know what to think about it, because he can't talk about it very long. He just like switches back to the Genesis narrative.
Yeah.
So there's a point where he does admit that, okay, I guess St. Paul is right. There are special exceptions, but that only happens through grace. But what's interesting about that is basically the premise of religious life anyway.
Yeah.
That like chastity in general, even within marriage, does require grace.
Totally.
And the only reason that vowed celibacy really works is because you are actually in relationship with God. Yeah. Because if it was just no sex and that was its meaning, then it would just be empty and kind of contentless.
Yeah.
I think like, I don't know, like sex draws us to like people and like two persons into relationship. I mean, it seems that that's one of the reasons why God like had this in his plan, is so that we would be drawn out of ourselves into relationship, which is ultimately preparing us for the ultimate relationship with God himself.
Yeah.
But if there's those that he calls to just kind of bypass that, like straight into a unique relationship with him, the kind of relationship that we'll have in heaven where no one will be married.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it does take a supernatural grace, and that's just because having a relationship with God is a supernatural
for a lot
grace.
it is. For a lot of church fathers, the coming of virginity was itself a sign that it was all real, that Christ was real, that he really had come, and that he had really gave the grace necessary to live as a new creation. So it's Ambrose, for instance, in a treatise on virginity, writes about virginity coming from Christ himself as the virgin, and that there couldn't be vowed virginity among the Gentiles, among the Jews, prior to the coming of Christ, because it is the dispensation of grace in the new covenant that actually allows you to live it out. So they're like walking evidence that Christ is real and grace is efficacious. And that's sort of denied, or not even addressed, I think, in Luther.
No. So he admits that there's special cases.
But that's what he does, is he always makes the special case take over the social institution. So like the confidence that Christianity had to say, yes, grace has become efficacious, and now a young man and a young woman can both vow themselves to virginity for all their life because God is real.
Right.
And so we believe in this to such an extent, we're going to make a dang institution out of it. All right. You just have to raise your hand and, and figuratively, it'll pull you up into a monastic order, right? It doesn't have to be something mysterious or weird or something that's only possible with this one special case. Rather, we're so confident in the dispensation of grace that we are going to have to devote lots of buildings and lots of land to housing all these virgins, because that was the expectation, especially as you went from the age of martyrdom ending. Virginity became the kind of new martyrdom for Christianity.
It just became very popular. People were drawn to it. They wanted it. Right.
And then Luther, and this is, I think, one of the difficulties, because we all inherit Protestantism as one of our many fathers. Luther, he doesn't deny it outright. He just takes it as an individual calling, like something that is only done on a level that can only really be ascertained by the individual within a sort of loneliness. There's no institution, there's no place to really recognize it as belonging to the social body, to the church.
It's like this belongs to a few special hermits, and that's it. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, not just that it belongs to a few special hermits, but that everything that Luther does, it always ends up attacking the social body. So instead of it becoming a reality of the body, where we have a church, and the church has monastics, the church has virgins, and this is what they do, it becomes like we have all these individuals, and they all believe. And extrinsically to that fact, Christ might pluck one of them up and say, you, special Paul, are called to the special life of being a virgin. But it's just very, I think, typical of the antisocial bent of a lot of Protestantism, which obviously has some great effects as well. It gives rise to an appreciation of the individual and the intensity and importance of personal call and personal vocation. So it's not something you can just, brush aside.
Right.
But especially in Luther, it's obvious that it is not a sort of valuation and love of the preciousness of the individual, but a discarding as so much dross the whole social.
Right. Yeah. Well, I wonder, too, in the way that he's regarding, like, a special grace. Like, I think that, I think we still fall into this, too, thinking that the call to religious life, like, you're given a special grace to endure a particular trial. You've been given a special interior grace to overcome lust in a way that's not given to other people. And that might be true, but I don't think that's really what it is. Like, to be given a strength not to do something or to give something up is a very negative way of looking at grace. And I think it really is, like, the grace is, like, not the strength, but the call into a particular kind of relationship with God, in which, like, that really does become fulfilling and satisfying and something that you really do desire. I mean, if you just think about the experience of falling in love, like, suddenly you want to be with this person and everyone else disinterests you. Like, you don't even want to talk to anyone else. Yeah. And it's not like you've been given a special grace to not desire all these other people. Yeah. It's just that this person rises so much above everyone else that, like, you're disinterested in those other things. And
Right.
I think that is the grace of monastic life.
Yeah.
Like you've experienced this call that's so particular to you. You're being invited into this unique relationship. And because it is a relationship, like it is kind of all encompassing. Like it does what relationships do.
Yeah.
And that kind of is the work of monastic life, is like to orient even more and more deeply every single part of your life, like into your relationship with God. So God enters into more and more and more of everything else that of the life that you are living. And I think that is the grace, the special grace that's being given, and not just like, oh, you've been given this like special skill
Yeah.
to be able to give up
Yeah.
this desire. What
I found remarkable about Luther is how, in many ways, he parallels, he's the opposite. He's like the reverse image of the introduction of virginity into the world, and he inaugurates a sort of new paganism. I'm not just trying to be rhetorical. I was thinking about this book, which I really like and would recommend. It's called The Body and Society by Peter Brown. It's not all good, but there are a lot of really good parts. And he's just trying to describe Christianity almost like a historical phenomenon,
Right.
kind of from the outside. So it's not really a book of faith, which I think he would probably be the first to admit. But he's looking at it the way, someone might look at Buddhism or something. And he describes the world into which the new ideal of virginity that comes from Christ, he describes the world that it shocked, the world that it scandalized. And it really did shock and scandalize the world of late antiquity,
Right.
Which is largely the Roman Empire. He points out that within the Roman ideal, marriage was the duty of everyone. And it was a duty because it was the way in which the social order reproduced itself. So it wasn't simply, you have to imagine it for a while, because we have this very beautiful romantic tradition of marriage that comes from Christianity. But within the Roman and the Greek tradition, it's not quite that way. Gender and sex are operative in the body, but as these very fiery kind of individual life processes that require certain behaviors of you. There's no real morality in the strict sense, like you are kind of expected as a young person to basically, burn off excess heat, as their medical treatises would have it. But ultimately, you're supposed to land in a marriage. And even if real love and eros becomes increasingly homosexual in these writings, like it's what men do together, it's the passionate pursuit, that all becomes sort of isolated to the world of men. And the man and woman become very, very important, but important precisely as functional parts that are ensuring the reproduction of the social order. So he writes here, it appears that the nuclear family, and with it a tendency to lay stress on effective bonds between husband and wife and parents and children, was a well-established feature of Roman society. What makes the 2nd century significant is the frequency with which domestic concord was associated with a nuclear family. This was played up symbolically as part of a public desire to emphasize the effortless harmony of the Roman order. And he goes on, the vast weight of empire had ensured that the Roman ideal of marital concord had taken on a crystalline hardness. The married couple were presented less as a pair of equal lovers than as a reassuring microcosm of the social order, which was undergoing a lot of threats at the time. The basic idea here is that virginity scandalized this order because the paterfamilias within a Roman family basically signified the continuity of the Roman Empire. Like, we will transmit respect for the gods to our children. We will have children, and we will give them love of the emperor. The same devotion we have to this empire, we will implant in our children. So actual procreation and then the reproduction of the social order were kind of meshed into one.
So it's like a state duty.
Yeah, it's a state duty. And you would be...
Or nation, because I didn't have that
Yeah, and in some ways, in this particular time, it really mirrors more like the nation of Israel, where, there's that rabbinic saying, I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly, but to refuse to procreate is akin to shedding blood. Because within this idea of the nation, the individual really is subordinate to his nation. So to not procreate, to not keep in continuity this worldly nation, is
it's a betrayal of your people.
Precisely.
So then Christianity shows up, and then
it's deeply scandalous.
People are abandoning the institution of marriage
and in fact,
to be celibate.
Right, and it was even, he's really great at the history here, because it wasn't just like they were showing up. They were actually showing up to tell the Roman order, don't worry, we still love marriage. They were being trying to be conservative, especially the bishops and leaders of the church. They're trying to say, like, whoa, don't kill us. We are, I promise, we're a part of this thing too, we're part of this world. But it really did have virginity. And this really was a great scandal, because in the virgin you have the person who says the social order ends with me, who says that I mean, it can sound incredibly arrogant from a Roman perspective. It's like saying, I am it. There's not a future here that I'm going to bestow onto others. I find a perfection
There's a fulfillment
in just how I'm created, and I'm going to die like this. Now, obviously, that could be a perversion, right? Like I think
really arrogant.
That could be really arrogant. That could be really selfish. I understand why the Romans were probably shocked by this, right? Mm-hmm. And it took a long time for Christianity to be able to express the worth of holiness and that kind of merit that says, yeah, I am loved by God, so my life has a certain completeness within itself, but that this is, this is part of the entirely new social order. This is not just against the Roman Empire. It's also the building of the new Christian order, which actively seeks to produce people who are signs of the great love God has for each one of us in particular. So when all of which is to say, when Luther is, rejecting the image of the Virgin that has been so painstakingly established within Christianity, inevitably, what falls out is a repetition in some ways of that same ideal. So now, if virginity is not a possibility of life, and everyone is supposed to be married, then several things happen. I mean, one of the main things that happens is procreation becomes reinscribed as a duty to the state,
right,
and as something that you do in justice. And Luther actually makes these kinds of arguments throughout the treatise.
Right. I mean, he has like the idea that that you ought to get married, you ought to take a wife, you ought to fulfill this duty, but for him it wasn't to the state, it was to God.
Yeah.
God desires you to procreate, and so this is your role. This is the thing that you ought to do, and that's part of why I think he was able to convince. I think this religious order did end up following his advice, and why he was so successful is because he was telling people, look, not only is celibacy an unnatural state, and that this that marriage is more chaste, and now you're not sinning, but like you will actually be like fighting against the devil. Like you are actually doing the thing for God. Like you are fighting the battle for God by taking a wife and having children, which again isn't totally wrong, but it does end up sliding or constricting your cultural imagination. So now, if this grace of virginity is just for like a teeny tiny select few individuals who are going to be like St. Paul's or just these random hermits, then the meaning of my gender, the meaning of my vocation is going to be tied to this duty of procreating and having children. And
that, I think, is the second thing that you see as an immediate fallout. Once gender can only really mean procreation, except by a sort of miraculous exception, then everything that is gendered about you, so everything that goes into being a woman or being a man, can be reduced fundamentally to the purpose of procreation. So it always has reference to a functional role. And this function of procreation is sort of the sealing of what it all means. Whereas with the image of the Virgin, you had this great mystery. And it's really important. It's like, I love the image you made of the roof being torn off the building, because it's not the case that gender wasn't for procreation, and procreation isn't the obvious way to understand what gender is and what it means. It's that in the image of the Virgin, there's the possibility of attaining the perfection of human life, not through procreation, and not just as a sacrifice, as if you simply say, well, I sort of see that and I cut it off for higher things, but as an actual mode of perfection, of flourishing, of happiness, of human life.
Right. And so with Luther, it kind of seems like you're putting the top back on the box again. It's like, oh, actually, we're not opening up men and women to this transcendent mystery. We're just closing it back up again.
There go the boys.
And I kind of threw out this idea, and it is kind of half-baked.
That's what we're here
for. when we were discussing, but I just kind of have this intuition that what was going on in Christianity, I think it is really helpful to keep in mind that Christianity is emerging from paganism. It's not as even in the middle of kind of medieval Christendom, you still have a church that's emerging from the pagan structures that it converted. And it's not like that change happens overnight.
Actively converting, conquering other nations. And
and it takes time, especially when it's a whole society. I mean, if it takes you as an individual person so long to change just habits that you know are wrong, what about a whole society? I mean, this is going to take generations. And so what I saw happening was that when you have virginity, as a real lifestyle for women, it does something in particular for women, which, first of all, you can no longer reduce woman to just this functionary role, you are just for procreation. You also can't reduce woman to being a deficient male, which was kind of what the general pagan philosophy was of women, because there's something whole and purposeful about herself before God and offering herself before God. And God doesn't take her as this deficient male.
Right.
So your imagination of who woman is changing, and that is also going to affect how women see themselves in marriage. And so my general impression is that there, as far as sexual morality, there was increasing sexual moral rules for even among married couples in the bedroom. And that part of this wasn't just Christianity. I think people have this idea that Christianity was just afraid of sexuality, and so then brought up all these oppressive rules. But I think you could also flip it and see okay, well, now you're dealing with this woman who's not just a functionary role. She's not just a lesser man. She really has her own personality and own real dignity. And so even when you are coming together as husband and wife, you can never do that seeing her as just an animal, as just a lesser man, as just this secondary role. And I think that takes kind of a while for Christianity to grow into that. But it is kind of a pattern that I'm seeing. And then I wonder if when kind of the top was put back on the box and woman is just shoved back into this role of your meaning is for procreation only, if that kind of starts to make sense of some of the very sexist things that you see coming in the 1950s that have a lot of Christian values, but then has a very reduced understanding of who woman is and what her role is, and that as being something that feminism is really reacting to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that right away, after the Reformation, I'm now going to read from Christopher Lasch, Women in the Common Life, one of the greatest books I've ever borrowed. I think that what you're intuiting there was actually registered right away by women of the Reformation, that the loss of the monasteries was the loss of the ideal of the Virgin, and then the ideal of and we'll talk more about this. I hope we'll talk more about the boys and the girls, but it's the loss of a fraternity and sorority as genuine, complete possibilities of human life. And that women really suffered this precisely because that was one more sphere of authority that was being diminished and one more place of freedom that was being curtailed in a society that was also beginning to feel that same shrinking of female possibilities in other ways.
Like the economic shift that we talked about in the last episode.
It comes later. But so I will read Christopher Lasch, whose work here is largely talking about the difference between modern feminist arguments and then older arguments that sometimes get called feminist but actually belong to this sort of very jovial battle of the sexes type literature. So he says, consider the claims advanced by the high-minded women who asserted their right to remain single in 17th century England. Most of these women were Catholics or High Church Anglicans, unreconciled to the Protestant celebration of married life and resentful of the growing contempt for spinsters. Have we spoken about that before? How like spinsters used to just mean you were useful and you spun.
Oh.
But then after the closure of the commons and basically the industrialization of spinning, etc., it just became a thing of contempt.
Oh,
so you can see right there how a woman who had a useful function in her not being married, she's spinning. Right?
Yeah, she's the
suddenly
spinster.
becomes the old spinster, like who's good for nothing. Anyways.
Right. Huh.
In reply, these women sought to restore the moral esteem formerly reserved for virginity. They deplored the dissolution of monasteries in England and sought to provide single women with a substitute for these useful institutions. Mary Ward, a Catholic, established a foundation for single women with the help of Queen Henrietta Maria. She did not deny that, quote, women are to be subjected to their husbands, nor did she question the social conventions, according to which men are head of the church, women are not to administer sacraments, nor preach in public churches. She insisted, however, that women were the intellectual equals of men, and that a life devoted to piety and learning had as much value as marriage. The belief that virginity is the noblest ideal of life did not entirely die with the nunneries, according to one scholar. In high church circles, it survived throughout the 17th century. In the 1630s, two sisters, Anne and Mary Collette, managed to found a kind of Protestant convent at Geding in Huntingdonshire, in spite of the opposition of their bishop, who advised them to marry in order that they might not be led into temptation. In a letter written to her uncle in 1631, Anne Collette expressed a strong desire to remain single. Quote, touching my condition of life, such content do I find. I neither wish nor desire any change in it. But as God may please, with my parents' leave, to give me grace and strength, that I may spend the remainder of my days without greater encumbrances of this world, which do of necessity accompany a married estate. In 1641, a Puritan pamphlet demanded a parliamentary investigation of the nunnery established by the Collette sisters. A little more. It's just great stuff. The most prominent advocate of a Protestant version of monasticism, Mary Astle, noted that, quote, very good Protestants continued to complain, even at the end of the 17th century, that, quote, monasteries were abolished instead of being reformed, which is what we said about Luther. She called for the creation of a, quote, monastery, or if you will, to avoid giving offense to the scrupulous and injudicious, we will call it a religious retirement, designed to provide a retreat from the world for those who desire that advantage. She ridiculed the widespread fear of dispeopling the world and extolled the virtue of a single life. Now, this is a really beautiful note because that fear of dispeopling the world by the 17th century, if you haven't watched the podcast yet, check out the one on capitalism because what she's responding to is the critique that, well, everyone needs to be married because states, which now are again, it goes back to the Roman sort of ideal in some ways. Right. Now, states are the fundamental purpose of this genderless, sexless thing we call the state is the real mark of human life and success.
Right.
And we serve it. You. Individuals are now subordinated to the species, or to the state in this case, which is to say they're being treated like animals. And so when people are, once again, expressing a desire to be virgin, they are receiving the argument that you are not doing your duty to the state. You are dispeopling, which is a beautiful word. dispeopling the world. And of course, by dispeopling the world, we mean also dispeopling the labor force at this point. Mm-hmm. Okay. The daughter of a high church mercantile family in Newcastle, Astle opposed the admission of. So he's pointing out that this is not feminism by any modern notion, because he's saying she opposed the admission of conformists to public office. She condemned immoral novels and plays. She upheld the divine right of kings. She's often mentioned as a precursor to Mary Wollstonecraft, but there's no evidence that her writer had any influence on her. Nor is there any reason to endorse the claim that, quote, it was 150 years before her vision was fulfilled by the establishment of the first women's colleges at Oxford and Cambridge. Far from being ahead of her time, she was hopelessly behind it. Her ideas appealed principally to conservatives like John Evelyn, who shared her wish that, quote, at the first Reformation in this kingdom, some of these demolished religious foundations had been spared, both for men and women, where single persons, devoutly inclined, might have retired and lived without reproach.
Oh, that's really fascinating.
So the point is that the loss of the symbol of the Virgin is simultaneous with the shrinking of possibilities for men and women, and for women in particular in a world that's shrinking in so many other ways for them. It is very easy for us, I think, because of the reality of the female experience, to, when we say everyone needs to get married, put a little asterisk and say especially women.
Yeah.
Part of this, I think, is nature. It's like, look, women are more affected by marriage.
Right.
Like 9 months pregnant, and that's just the start of it, right? Breastfeeding, young children. It is called matrimony, which has its root in mater, mother, for a reason. Like, it is something that, right. So I think it's easy to see in the loss of the symbol of the Virgin the kind of loss of a hope for women that was stronger in some ways than the hope for men. Because often for men, what was so amazing and what seemed to be such a grace was that we can live in chastity and fraternity unto a state of perfection. And for women, I think the social implications were more immense.
They're higher stakes.
Yeah, the stakes are huge.
Just because the world was closed to them in a lot of ways. And then when you look at what women were doing in monastic life, like they were reading, they were writing, they were doing scientific research, they were creating music.
Yeah.
I liked that Christopher Lasch kind of noted that she was kind of behind her time, in sense, like advocating for this thing that was in the past, and also ahead of her time, because you see that kind of returning with opening up colleges to women, which I have thought about that before, about colleges and academia being like almost like a secular space for women to reach that monastic ideal in a world that doesn't have that imagination.
Yeah.
Just something I've quietly speculated about before. But
yeah, I've got thoughts on that, but we shouldn't go down that road.
But what I think is kind of helpful to kind of wrap up the Luther stuff is, okay, so Luther really was responding to like real corruption.
Yep.
I think he was also responding to his own personal experience. Like, he experienced a lot of scrupulosity, and so his experience of chastity and his relationship with God in generally was marked by fear, and that's not what grace is. That's not what operates. And so celibacy and virginity really did seem like this unique gift that came once in 100 years to just a few, because he was a part of religious order, religious life, but that wasn't something that he experienced just because his relationship with God was a fearful one.
Right.
And you can't have that in order to be actually receptive to God's grace. So there was real corruption, real confusion at the time, and probably, I mean, I would presume that that God did have a plan for Luther, that there was real reform that was needed for these monastic communities. My intuition also is that a lot of people ended up in those communities who didn't have authentic vocations. But it seemed like parents at that time had a very heavy hand in what their children did and directed them in both their marriages and then also if they went off to religious life. And that could really mess up both marriages and religious life.
Yeah, and like you say, it always is a rising up out of paganism. And you hear, as a Catholic kid, you hear all these stories of saints, and it's almost a trope that their parents don't want them to consecrate their lives to virginity, to join an order, and that the first kind of big story of their saintliness is how they confront their parents in order to do this. You know, it can be easy to just think of these parents as just like horrible plot points that need to be overcome.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can see, well, if we're coming up out of paganism, what we are always fighting against, both the parent and the saint, the saint child, are involved in a process of mutual conversion. Like it's tough, it's hard, but they're working together in some way, because the parent has to learn that the empires of this world and the continuity of human power is not sufficient. It's not sufficient for happiness. It's not sufficient for holiness. And ultimately, it doesn't suffice for God. And so they're learning in the symbol of the Virgin to rise up out of the pagan understanding, which is basically subvert the individual to the species so that we have some semblance of immortality here on earth. That, you know, I'm going to die, you're going to die, but we can make this business prosper forever, St. Francis, or we can make this family name prosper forever, St. Thomas, or you know what I mean? Like there's a sense always that it's the first appearance of the Virgin within a family has, people can be easily tempted to see that same arrogance, that same pride that
right. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with control, and so you can have that plot point of like wanting to control the future and to pass on the family line. And I think that you can also see that same vice show up in religious ways when you do have parents who are like, all right, we're putting you in monastic life, and really we expect you to become the abbot of this very wealthy and prominent monastery.
Totally. Yeah.
And so it's like, all right, well, like we know that at the end of the day, God's the one who controls things, but we would like to play a little bit more into his sphere. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there was definitely problems that Luther was responding to, but instead of reforming that order, like he just wants to abolish that. I think a lot of it was in accord with his own personal experience. But I think the thing that he was right about was this idea that like it would be better to be married and not be in sin than to take these vows and to be like living this like technical chaste life while having a mistress on the side. So I think he was right about that, but I don't think that he was unique in his perspectives at all. So when I was reading up for like how to present like what is the symbol of the Virgin, I think one of the best texts I've ever read on virginity or celibacy was St. Gregory of Nyssa. I would highly, highly recommend it to anybody. And I think it was the first time, well, I don't know if it was the first time, but I think he can be a little bit confusing to read when you first hear him talk about virginity, because now, since we're living in a post-Protestant society, when you hear virgin, you just think, oh, like they haven't had sex. And that's it. It's just like a certain experience that someone hasn't had. Yeah,
and even the value that we see on virginity as a sort of reaction to lust in society is virginity as a waiting room for having sex with your spouse eventually.
Right. I mean, when I hear virgin, it's not even just you haven't had sex, it's you haven't had sex yet. Right. And so that's not the way that he's using this word at all. It's very clear from the beginning that he's meaning a lifestyle. And so for him, it's an obvious contradiction when you're a virgin, but you're not living virginity, which is not the way that we use that word today. That wouldn't really make sense.
Sure.
But he understands that there's like that, like sex implies a lifestyle. Like if you, I mean, especially at this point when like we don't have like the same like technology for contraceptives, like back in the day, like if you're having like sex, that means that you're a part of a lifestyle in which children can come from that. That changes the things that you care about. It changes the lifestyle that you have to live. It changes the things that you're worried about. Like you have children, you need to take care of them. You need money. You have a wife. So like it means a whole lifestyle. And when you say that someone is a virgin, you're also saying that this implies this whole lifestyle. And the way that he sets up the text, he begins with this like praise of virginity as being like this symbol of like purity, like pure dedication to God. And he goes about and starts explaining the advantages of virginity. And what I was expecting to read in this text was kind of to say like, oh, like lust is so dirty and so distracting, and now you won't have that anymore. And he doesn't even talk. I'm sure he talks about lust, but I just don't really remember that being a big feature in this text. Really what he's emphasizing is that if you are married, you just have a lot more attachments in this world. And it's not like it's this big bad thing, but it's just true. You have to care about a lot more stuff. You have children and they could die. You have a spouse and he could die. If things don't go well for your business, your whole family suffers and you care about your children suffering. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you are celibate, then like you don't have to be afraid of your spouse dying. You don't have to be afraid about the welfare of your children. And even if things go very poorly for you, like it's just you and God. Mm-hmm. And so it's easier for you to cultivate the virtue of detachment, which is not like a passive, oh, I don't care about things anymore. But just that, like, I guess kind of the recognition that everything changes except for God. And so he's going to be the one consistent thing that I hold on to. Yeah. And everything else that comes to me, like, I just take it as pure gift. And if it goes away, that also is a gift. And I just need to be prepared for more gift. And that kind of attitude you can also cultivate in married life too, but it's a lot more difficult when you have people that are on the line, because totally. Maybe you've cultivated that interior disposition, but your son hasn't yet. Yeah. Your daughter hasn't, maybe your husband hasn't. Yeah.
No, I mean, this is always the sort of looming threat of the virgins in a society, is that they don't have a lot you can threaten them with. And right. the Christian virgin is the sort of ideal of this, because he's not like the eunuch where, yeah, maybe technically he can't procreate, but his desires might be totally manipulatable.
Well, his desires are still fulfilled by the state.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Just because he can have, like, he might not be able to procreate, but he has access to all these women now. Right. And it doesn't really matter about who he's with, because he can't have children with them. So the virgin properly is a virgin of the heart. Right.
As well as of the body. But what you produce when you have a class of virgins within a society is people that don't have property, don't have wives, don't have families. Mm-hmm. And at every point,
you can't really threaten them with those things, like, with the loss of those things.
To see a rising virgin class within a society is to see at the same time a loss of like imperial centralization. I don't think these two things can exist mutually, because if you have a class of people whose loyalty is to God, and then to the spiritual power, then you can't just have sort of tyranny of temporal power where you say, we're going to tax you this way if you don't do that, or we're going to raise the cost of land if you do this, etc. Mm-hmm. This is why often virginity is tied with the freedom and liberty of the church. Like it's the way in which the freedom of the church from temporal power is maintained. It's like, yeah. But I think the point that you're making seems to be most fundamentally that virginity is a life devoted to God, and that if we reject sex, it's because a life devoted to God requires detachment.
Right.
And sex attaches. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that I think like that's definitely true, and that's why like the church has understood unmarried life as being like a more perfect life. Mm-hmm. But I think it more has to do with the fact that it's so much easier to cultivate that virtue when you have a lot less distractions running up against you. Like it's possible to cultivate that kind of virtue in marriage, but it's just helpful to know that like you have a lot more against you in that battle. It's just going to be a lot more difficult. And that's not a bad thing. But it is certainly the case. I thought what was helpful about what Gregory of Nyssa was writing is that it was clear that it's a whole lifestyle, and it goes down to the heart, and it's not contentless. I think like virginity is like you haven't had sex yet is really contentless.
Sure.
And it gets to the idea that ultimately what's at the heart of virginity is a relationship with God. And that the grace that's being given is not just a grace not to do something,
right.
but an invitation into like a thing beyond you.
I think one of the critiques people often have of virginity is that it can seem, I think, asocial, or like it has a certain evaluation that says the individual is more important than everybody else. And this certainly seems to be the logic of Luther, and also the logic of nation states. And bizarrely, the logic of our own world, where it's like the one prohibition. Like everyone has to make sure, not that they're having children, but that we're all detached from our sex in such a way as to need to find things and people and items in order to fulfill it. Like what becomes really crucial in our age is not so much that we need a really big labor force because we've outsourced that to other nations, but that we have no satisfaction. And so we provide a steady locus of consumption within a large global capitalistic regime. And so it's very important to detach people from virginity, which is quite literally detachment.
Right.
But for kind of different reasons. I want to just say there's a uniqueness. We're not quite, I mean, anyone who was like listening to this and then saying like, so now we live in an age in which everyone has this enforced duty to procreate for the sake of the state, it would be to not take into account the difference that our age adds to that. It's like, well, sort of, but the reproduction of the state at this point really has very little to do with producing whatever 1.5, 2.1 children that is normal now, and much more to do with experiencing your own sexuality as a sort of aching need that has to be fulfilled through various purchases and through various objects, which are all manipulatable.
Well, it just kind of seems that the way that you fulfill your duty to the state is by being a consumer.
Yeah.
And so, like, still you have the situation of religious life not conforming with that state desire.
Yeah.
And teaching people to be more detached and to be less of consumers. And I think that even goes down into the way that we live out our sexuality. Like, it just is, another thing that needs to be consumed.
Yeah. Well, to summarize where we are so far, because I want to then move on.
Right.
Virginity was a hard-won symbol that opened up the door of possibility for Christian men and women everywhere. And its maybe most fundamental contribution to our experience of gender was that it affirmed the goodness of being a man, being a woman, not as a lack that's only fulfilled in procreation, but as a mystery given to us as a completeness and a wholeness. And this is not just thought about, but lived out in the monasteries as an ideal that men and women can attain to perfection, even the highest form of perfection possible, not through marriage and procreation, but in fact through simply being totally devoted to God.
Right.
That this was rejected because of real corruption and sin, and that's how it always goes. We're always responsible for everything that goes wrong. Trust. If we feel like we're bashing Luther, it's just because we realize that Luther could only have been effective in the way he was effective if Catholics were, as usual, completely lame, pathetic, worldly creatures. So we end up in a state where for the first time, gender, being a man or being a woman, is something that you can fundamentally fail at.
Right.
This is crucial to say, because once gender is reduced, once you have someone like Luther say, for all her faults, woman has one that redeems all. She has a womb. Once that can be the watchword of a social order as it goes forward into reproductive mercantilism and early capitalism, then you have the ability for men and women to fail by virtue of not getting married,
right,
at the one thing that makes sense of gender, the one thing that gives it intelligibility.
Right.
And I think that is our fundamental situation still. There's been a lot of change. There's been a lot of difference. We are obviously living in a very beige, secularized world where, I would frankly welcome a nice religious argument for why we should only get married. I mean, no one even makes that anymore. Like, I don't hear the Lutherans raging against whatever's left of the Catholic virgins. But actually, I believe the orders are growing. I mean, generally speaking, right? Yeah. Anyways. But for the first time, you can fundamentally fail.
Right. Well, I don't know. Maybe the second time with like paganism.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. I mean, within Christian.
But, within
world.
like a still like the Christian like vestiges that are left in our world, like we have a more biblical notion of men and women. Like we have, I think, a more unique understanding of the dignity of each human person, whereas that wasn't the case in pagan society.
Yeah.
There was hierarchy, but no dignity. And then I think in Catholicism, you really had both, and that was growing. And now we just really don't like hierarchy. But that aside, I think, where was I going?
Well, I think that the loss of the symbol of the Virgin means that you produce a new kind of person, really, who...
well, you want to make sense of your experience of being a man or a woman.
Yeah.
And really the only experience that makes sense of that is who you're dating and who you get married to.
Right.
And then if you don't align to your society's, like, I don't know, specific stereotypes or within, like, getting married, like, this isn't something for me or I don't feel like I fit, then you fail at your gender. Whereas I don't think that was really in people's imagination in the same way.
Yeah.
It wasn't like
obviously you could miss your vocation, you could feel lost, but it was within a world where even up to the last moment, before your death, you could vow it all to God. You could take your maleness, your femaleness, and give it to God and consecrate yourself. And that was always a genuine possibility. Whereas now, in the last moment of death, there's nothing. I mean, if you didn't manage to procreate or to experience the sort of total sexual fulfillment, which is supposed to be the basic peak of beige existence, that's it. You're done. You're dead. And so I think people face this, and it's made. Yeah, I think I would say this just in reference to ultimately answering the question of transgenderism. I don't think we're not here to make like a sort of wild claim that somewhere at the heart of Luther's doctrines here, there's like a transgender ideology or something like that.
But it does set the ground for, okay, if I'm going to evaluate my experience and my meaning as a man or a woman in terms of procreation, and I don't feel drawn to that, I don't feel like I fit in that lifestyle, then it opens up the possibility for, I think, queer theory to step in and to provide a lot of like peace. Like, oh, you think that you're failing at your gender. Well, really, gender is a construction.
Right, exactly.
Really, gender isn't what you think it is. There's more to gender than what you think it is. And in that way, it kind of mirrors what virginity was doing before. Because before you could have virginity swoop in and say like, hey, well, actually, there's a meaning for your gender that's beyond procreation. So both are kind of giving this message. But I think for virginity, that meaning comes from God. Like, actually, like, the meaning of your gender ultimately, like, this is a gift that came from God. What would happen if you gave it totally back to him?
Yeah.
Like, what would that be? Whereas I think for queer theory, it's like, well, there's more to gender than what meets the eye. And the secret is that you get to control it.
Yeah.
You get to decide its meaning.
Yeah.
And you can choose the pathway that you want to go. And And so like you create your own meaning instead of receiving it from above, which is supposed to be really fulfilling. But I think a lot of people really are unfulfilled because everyone at some point does have to face the fact that like self-created meaning really isn't that meaningful.
Yeah. Well, it's just like saying it's all what you put into it or something, which is lame.
Yeah, it's like the meaning and purpose of my life is what I decided to me. So really there is no meaning. And the fact that you could have chosen something else means that what you did choose is also irrelevant.
Yeah, it's just masturbatory. Like there's no other that breaks in and bestows. It's just all self-referential, which is sad.
Yeah. I mean, I think kind of the sad situation with transgenderism, like there is a reaction to something true. It's like, all right, like I have this intuition that there's something more to my gender and my experience of my own body than procreation or falling in love with a man and falling in love with a woman. And so like you have the solution, which is, well, like just become the opposite sex. But then the problem with that is like you still fail because you can't totally fit into that category. And you also can't ever hit the ideal of that category, which is manifested in having children.
Yeah.
And there's ways that people are getting around it kind of.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah. But I think everyone also knows that it's not the real thing. And so even so, there is something unfulfilling in that because you can't actually access the real thing by transitioning. Yeah,
it strikes me that we're not far from our past. Like queer theory is obviously a Catholic heresy, and the conservative biological reaction is obviously the Protestant heresy doubled down upon. And what the church offers is neither.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult knife to balance on.
Mm-hmm.
But the difficulty today is that sexuality is basically conceived of as static and on the model of the Protestant theory, so that when you fail to meet it, the presumption is that you are some other static thing. This might take a second. Let me just say it. The idea that I've been reading a lot of just accounts of people, especially Christians, who are trans and who are expressing what they're going through. And one thing that strikes me as very common is that they approach the closed ceiling of procreation and reproduction as the entirety of the meaning of gender. They find that in some way they don't match up to its ideal. Very often it's just like a lack of attraction for the opposite sex, a desire to dress like the other sex sometimes, but some kind of formative experience of failure. And that failure immediately becomes interpreted as having no place within Christianity, because the thought is basically that is all Christianity offers, is sort of a recapitulation of what we can discern from biological investigation of the human as an animal. And so very often the tragedy of these stories is that the rejection of the church and then the rejection of the reproductive paradigm are one and the same. And the Catholic is in this difficulty where it's like, well, actually, I think we should address this reproductive paradigm as not being proper to man, but not, like just because that's a problem, that doesn't mean that that's all there is.
Right.
And so the other thing that seems apparent when you have the Virgin as the model is that all sexual experience, all being gendered, has a dynamic path in front of it. Like there's a call for everyone.
Right.
Just by virtue of having the body be obviously designed to give yourself to another.
Right.
The kind of nuptial meaning of the body sets you on a path that within Christianity has as its perfection virginal life. And so the response to any difficulty within the nuptial body, within the fact that I've been given this thing and I got to do something with it, the response, it seems to me, when the virgin is the ideal, is naturally one of pilgrimage. It's like, how do I get from where I am now closer to where I ought to be?
To the ideal. Yeah.
How do I make myself an offering? How do I take sex, which is somehow the very social meaning of the person, and devote it? Is it marriage? And if it's marriage, how do I continue in marriage itself, not as this static endpoint where it's like, now I'm using my equipment, but in marriage itself, how does that move me towards the ideal of the virgin, where my life, my body becomes a gift for God, where I realize...
Because even within marriage, chastity is necessary, and you still have to grow in virtue in that area. And so it's like the ideal of the virgin is a helpful reminder, even for married couples, that kind of detachment and that kind of growth in virtue and slow movement towards total dedication to God, that's not just for celibate lifestyle, but it is something for everyone. It's just being done in a different lifestyle. And I think that is helpful for people who aren't in a vocation or are struggling with their sexuality and what does it mean to live out my gender. And I think the first thing really is the call that everyone has been given, which is to like seek God first. And that's not really palatable in today's world.
What happens, I think, is that people are wonderfully freed from a lot of pain and suffering by what I think is fundamentally a Christian realization, but then without Christianity to guide them further. So they have this realization like, wait a minute, something about this gift of this body, in all of its confusion and difficulty, needs to be affirmed as such, and not just related as a failure or success to the fact of reproduction.
Right.
Like so I need to in some ways say thank you for this, for this thing that's going on, because I'm at step one of a dynamic path towards virginal fulfillment in the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
But we don't have Christianity, really. We have trappings and remnants. And so what I find in a lot of testimonies of trans people is the great relief that comes with being able to say, no, you know what, I don't fit this thing, so I'm different.
Yep.
That affirmation is all we have.
Right.
There's no, and here's what to do now with this difference.
Right.
Here's how to become chaste. Here's the direction of life as it moves towards an ideal, which is the worship of God.
It doesn't become like the first step in your relationship with God, but it becomes the first and final step. I mean, because there really is a peace in coming to terms with your situation. Like, this is where my desires are at.
Yeah. This
is how I feel about married life. This is how I feel about my own self and my own gender. And I think there is a genuine freedom in that, because I think that is the first step that all of us are supposed to do in whatever situation that we have when we're trying to grow towards God. It's like, all right, here's the reality of where I'm at and the brokenness and confusion of my desire. And I know that God is entering into that and to loving that. And there's a real genuine freedom in honesty, because that's the first step towards truth. But then I think there is a further step into actual relationship with God. Like, okay, so the first thing that I need to do is just stop being so afraid of the truth of my own situation, being honest with myself and with other people about the truth of my own situation, allowing God to enter into that, and then stepping out into relationship with Him further along the path of holiness. And I don't think that's a unique human experience. And I think that's something that we're all called to be doing. Yeah. I think part of the frustration with people that I know who, I mean, I'm friends with more gay people than trans people. But the frustration of my gay friends is like, it just seems like, it's just like, the church is telling me that I have to learn how to live with a chronic illness now, or just something that's purely a cross to me. And there's a fear that there's I think it's the same fear of religious life, that it's a fear that God actually will not be satisfying. Mm-hmm. That if I step out into a call of this relationship, that there won't actually be something more for me. And I think that really is the test of faith. I mean, you really can't grow into relationship with anyone unless you take a step forward and choose to trust something that you can't prove entirely, and then see what becomes of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not easy either way. I think what the sign of the Virgin does to society is it makes gender a very combative, adventurous relation to the world. So it's something great because it's something to do with life, and it's obviously the sign of the social on the individual body, so it's very paradoxical. It's a call. Mm-hmm. It draws us forth, and it draws us to combat our own selfishness. I mean, this is what I think is so fundamental about gender, is like it is, if we wanted to be really selfish, like gender would be the thing that we'd have to destroy, because It is the very presence of the social in the individual body. It's like you are meant for another, you are meant for more, you transcend in some way towards the other. And I think the great difficulty people find themselves in is they know that about gender. They know that about sex. They know it's supposed to be an adventure. And so when they can't find any place for themselves within a sort of narrow reproductive model, it seems like we're kind of translating that dynamic adventure that is growth in virtue, that is proceeding towards the model of the Virgin, with a kind of just a growth in, like, what's the word? In like the way of our world towards a greater and greater individualism. Mm-hmm. It's like this thing about being trans, and one of the wonderful things it seems to bring to people's life is this sense of opposition to power, a sense of the important, like being called forth and set against something by virtue of your experience of gender. You have a task within transgenderism, you have a mission. And it's going to be described in words that might be really foreign to people. You know, we're here to trouble the heteronormative narrative. We're here to destroy, the tyranny of binary sex opposition, etc. But I think we should have more sympathy than just to see this as like craziness or something like that, because all of these things are giving back to the experience of gender that profound sense of adventure that seemed to belong to it when it wasn't closed off as simply a functional role. Mm-hmm. There's a way in which transgenderism is better understood as a returning of oppositional excitement and adventure to what really should be an oppositional and exciting reality, which is the very way in which human nature is drawn out of a sort of individualism and into social life. Yeah. But that isn't easy, I think, to swallow. I think that's it's a lot. I want to say maybe one more thing, and then we could possibly close this up. We had wanted to discuss very briefly the social value of virginity, and I think I see this a lot in people who don't feel any attraction to people, and then kind of make an identity, whether asexual or gay or trans, on that basis. That one of the things that is obviously the case in the Christian tradition is, well, maybe I'll put it this way. Virginity is something we all experience as children. And
Right.
virginity is something that maybe it seems really hard to imagine in this sort of somehow simultaneously sexless and hypersexualized world. But it's pretty easy to imagine if you've had siblings.
Right.
Because siblings are just not someone that you want to have marriages with.
They're not options.
They're not options. The experience of virginity as something good and normal and worthy of being maintained is available to all of us.
Right.
And sometimes we think of the church as simply offering this very foreign thing.
Unnatural.
And certainly how the Romans saw the first Christian virgins as doing something unnatural. And it's certainly how modernity sees the virgins now, as doing something vaguely like repressed and unhealthy, like they're spidery people who just, need to do as the Romans did. But it seems like if we actually look at the family, the family is a place where virginity is beautiful, wholesome, and simply the order of the day.
Right.
It's not complicated. What Christianity is doing is not speaking its word into a void.
Right. It's not like here I am instituting this new unnatural state, but it's taking a natural state of brother and sister, but expanding it to everyone. So now everyone is brother and sister. You become the sister of everyone. You become the mother of everyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's affirming. Christianity is affirming that we're good. Mm-hmm. So it's not that we are wicked, and so grace and redemption and the Virgin all come in as this like alien visitor from another planet, but rather, as it's said of the marriage blessing, there's a blessing that continues, that survives the fall, that survives the flood, that nothing washes away, that the love within the family is precisely the sign of the redemption that's continuously present in the world. When Christ comes to us, he comes as a child into a holy family to reveal that God is as a father to us. So the family is obviously the grounds of the intelligibility of the redemption. When Jesus comes to us, it's like he says, hey, you don't have much, but you have these families. So I'm going to use what you experience there, and I'm going to tell you about who God is and about what he's about to do. Through this language, because this is where you do know love. No matter how crooked and corrupt you are, you know how to give good gifts to your children. No matter how horrible you are, when I say God is Father, you don't think wicked thoughts. You think good thoughts. Right. And this is by grace that the family is preserved in this way. And yeah, just as you said, I think the experience of virginity is present here, in that when we talk about it as an ideal, it need not be something so wildly foreign. Like, it really is the case that the church's mission on earth is to make all men brothers, to make women sisters, to become one family. Right. This is actually the ideal. Right. And this is even sort of the prophetic ideal of the kingdom of heaven, where they will be neither given or received or given, taken and given. In marriage. Marriage ain't happening. Okay, all of which is to say that I think
you really do have an experience of the church being a family, because you have these people that are the brother of everyone, that are the sister of everyone. And I think like the men and women that I've met in religious life, I mean, you do hear people talk about their own experience of freedom to be able to love. And I think it does come from this experience of like, I have a heart that wants to embrace the whole world, because that is the heart that Jesus has. Like, I want to have his heart for the whole world. And now at last, I have the freedom to do so. Right. Like, I have the freedom to enter into the heart of the church and to love everyone as my brother, as my sister. And
we literally call them brothers and sisters. Like, lay people too religious even refer to them as brothers and sisters. And it's not by accident. And so one of the things I notice in a lot of these kind of trans narratives, which are so important to, I think, listen to, is that the experience of other people as just being brothers or just being sisters within the world that they're given the most natural thing is to say, like, I have failed at my apparent gender.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that summarizes the contribution that the loss of the Virgin makes to transgenderism now. That in our world as we're given it, it takes an immense amount of work to interpret the experience of brotherliness and sisterliness as eschatologically meaningful, as part of what should be happening, as something that you can use in a path towards your own redemption and towards your own fulfillment.
Right.
That this instead becomes a sort of diagnosable problem to be resolved by.
So maybe one way of thinking what you're talking about is like there is a certain ideal. I mean, I think the ideal of virginity is you are the spouse of God and you are the brother or sister to the world. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also like the goal of every human person. And so if you have this experience of like, oh, I failed at my gender because I'm not sexually attracted in the way that I'm supposed to, or like I failed at this procreation thing, it's like if you have this understanding that ultimately I'm to be the spouse of God and the brother or sister to everyone, like as long as you embrace like, this is my role to be sister to everyone. This is my role to be brother to everyone. Because that's certainly true of married people. Like you are spouse to one, and to everyone else, you are brother. To everyone else, you are sister.
Sure better be.
But like you don't fail at your gender just for not being able to procreate, because there's still this like essential role of being like brother to the world and sister to the world.
And I don't think this happens without Christ. Like this isn't something that Christianity just achieved. It's something that it really introduced.
It's real. It's like when you hear people talk about like, oh, I just want to make a difference. I want to make a contribution to humanity. And it's just like, that's so faceless. It's just like, I'm just imagining like a sea of numbers. Like that means nothing. Like you want to contribute to humanity. You want to love humanity. That's just not a goal that inspires me, because it's just not particularized in any way. But as soon as Christ comes into the picture, it's not just that you have this bond with other people, like, oh, I can connect with everyone because we all share the same human experience. When you do become united to Christ in baptism and through his church, you actually do belong to the body. Mm-hmm. You actually, like your relationship with other people is actually a familial relationship. There's something real and that's not imaginary, which just makes a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, you really feel it too, I think. Like when you encounter other people who have also encountered Christ in the same way that you do, like there is an instant familiarity. Like you can feel that you belong to the same body because you're like, oh, you know the same person that I do.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, well, dare we summarize and end?
Yep.
The symbol of the Virgin, a hard-won symbol of Christianity, has been abolished from our cultural imagination. And we live under a specter of
restricting our vision,
closing
the roof on the house.
To procreation in terms of the explanation of what gender means, and then more realistically towards unhinged sexual consumption as a way of maintaining a current empire. That's what we get to do. And when we experience dissatisfaction with this, there's little available to us besides sort of therapeutic modes. And I think this just goes to show that without real conversion to the church, things won't get better. So simply doubling down on the power and force of the sealing, can you do that? Simply reinforcing the sealing of the procreative body. Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a lot of value to it. Like, there's a lot of value to this sort of scientific research that puts, sexual difference in terms of, its genes and its skeletal structures and all the ways that it affects us. Ultimately is missing the point, which is that it's the very sense that there is no beyond, that there's nothing transcendent about sexual difference itself. That means we have people who are experiencing themselves as fundamentally failing at gender. So, convert, I guess. Any last words?
That about sums it up.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's great. Okay, we're going to continue on. So the books today were The Body and Society. Read the first couple chapters. Women in the Common Life. It was phenomenal. Luther. Read them and weep. And is there anything else?
I think that's it.
Okay. All right. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.